StudyIQ IAS, आपका सिलेक्शन हमारा मिशन।
Welcome to this second session on ethics, ethical philosophers. Last time we had discussed the three great ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. And as I was preparing for this session, I realized, can we put all these philosophers in a particular category? Can we analyze them in a particular manner so that those that are listening or those that are trying to study these philosophers are able to relate to what they have said? These are extremely complex philosophies, so my objective was to simplify it. Okay, so let's start understanding the basics of what they said. In all contexts, in all philosophers, we are talking about their philosophy of ethics. Now, what is ethics? Those of you that have watched my session on ethics would know that when I speak of ethics, I talk about what is ethics. To my simple understanding, ethics actually means what is right and what is wrong. This is the simplest way in which you can understand ethics. What is right and what is wrong? In fact, all these philosophers, whether Greek philosophers or modern philosophers, are all concerned about determining what is right and what is wrong. So, the next question is, what is right? By and large, most of the philosophers agree, but there are differences. So, the basic understanding has to be what is right and what is wrong. Having understood that, they also look at and they also feel that something which is right is good for human being. Because that is the ultimate objective of any activity. What is good for you? Everyone is trying to assess as to what is good. And most of the philosophers believe that what is right, that is good. Then the key question is, what is good? And this is, at this level, the determination of good is considered by these philosophers at three different levels. The first level is the physical level. Physical, what is good for senses? Let's put it senses. The second stage after that, above that, is that of intellect. And the final stage is the spiritual one. So, if you look at all the philosophers through the history, you will find they are trying to understand what is good physically, what is good intellectually, what is good spiritually, and what is the dominant feature in these philosophers, whether they are focusing on spiritual, they are focusing on intellect, they are focusing on physical. Last time, when I spoke to all of you on Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, you would have discovered that I was mentioning this term, they are into virtue ethics. For Plato or Aristotle, the prominent feature was this, spiritual. It is not that they were not concerned about intellectual and physical, but the dominance was that of spiritual. So, sometimes it became difficult for everyone who studied these philosophers to actually relate to what they were saying. So, when Plato talked about utopia, you were not sure what exactly was he meaning because it was in the realm of imagination. It did not exist. Or for that matter, when Plato talked about horsiness, the idea of horse, what is that idea? Idea is the ideal, what it ought to be. So, they are more into the spiritual world that is beyond physical and intellectual. Physical and intellectual attributes are used to understand the spiritual, but the focus is on spiritual. Now, both Stoics and Epicureans came after a few decades or maybe a century after Plato. Though, of course, the Stoics studied in the same academy which was set up by Plato, but they departed partly from there. So, the focus shifted from the spiritual part, which is explained through metaphysics, to the physical part, which is the intellect part they are talking about. So, Stoics moved from spiritual to intellectual. For them, reason, which is intellectual reason, became the thing. The whole focus of Stoics was on reason. Not to say that the earlier Greeks, the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, Plato and Socrates were not talking about reason. Yes, they did. But for them, it was more in the spiritual context. So when Socrates says knowledge is virtue, so when he's talking of knowledge, he's talking of the spiritual knowledge, emanating out of intellectual, but the dominance of his spiritual. And hence, it is more amorphous in nature. It is not so concrete as in case of intellectual and physical. So, Stoics were more intellectual in that sense, in the sense of focusing totally on reason, human reason, because they also believed that human beings, and that's where there is some similarity between what they say and what Aristotle said, in terms of human beings are superior to other beings in the world, because human beings can reason. And that's why the focus is here. Again, I'd like to repeat, there's no disconnect between that. What I'm looking at, the predominance of the thought process, whereas in Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, the predominance and the conclusions were from and for spiritual existence or something beyond physical and intellectual existence, and hence they are in a different category. As I said earlier, Stoics brought it to intellectual level, and then we have Epicureans who bring it down to senses. I am repeating it time and again that it is not that they were not concerned about, like Epicureans were not concerned about intellectual pursuits. No, they were. They were talking about mind. But the predominant determinant of the good was physical. The predominant determinant of good for Stoics was intellectual. The predominant determinant of good for ancient Greek philosophers was spiritual. If you keep this frame in mind, when we discuss future philosophers and their ethics, you will be able to understand them better, the level, and comparisons also will become that much easier. So now we go on to the Greek philosophers, Stoics and Epicureans. We will first discuss Stoics. Now, very interestingly, Stoicism emerged as a consequence of an event that took place close to Greece. The first Stoic philosopher, Zeno, was a businessman, was a trader, and he got marooned. His ship got wrecked. And when he came to Greece and started studying there, he discovered how to manage adversities. So the fundamental principles in case of Stoic is basically intellectual and emotional. It's not so physical, because they believe that physical world exists as it is. And this is a principle that you must understand. Stoics and even Epicureans went on to believe that there is a given world. There is a given physical world. And in this sense, they had moved from pure spiritual part to actual physical existence of the world. They talked about atoms. They also talked that these atoms were interrelated with each other, and there was some supreme force that was determining their interrelationship, which was also predetermined. So they accepted the existence of an interdependent world, which is self-governing, so to say, over which human beings did not have much of an impact. What Stoics felt was that though you cannot determine what's happening outside you, you can determine what is happening inside you. In that sense, though they were deterministic in the sense that they were of the view that everything has its own dynamics. It moves in its own way. There are principles that are governing it. And to the outside world, to this physical world that exists around you, which has its own dynamics, you can't do much to them, but you have that amount of free will within you to respond to the inputs that are coming from this predetermined world. So you can't influence something which is happening outside, but you can determine your own response. So some analysts called Stoics soft determinists, meaning thereby they say that Stoics believe that not everything is predetermined. Your own actions can be determined by how you evolve as an individual. And that's why Stoics in that sense are a bit similar to the ancient Greek philosophers, because they also talk about virtues. They also talk about what sort of virtue should a human being have for him to be able to respond to the inputs that are coming from a predetermined world. And they also felt that human beings can evolve, change, and acquire those attributes, those virtues which they list out. They say that if you evolve as an individual in that manner of having acquired those attributes and virtues, then your response will be better. And in Stoics world, that is good for human being, evolving as an individual to be ready to respond to what is coming from a predetermined world, a world you cannot change. So there is one world which you cannot change, which is the external world. There's an internal world in you which you can change. So internal world is not predetermined. That's the difference between a pure determinist and a soft determinist. That's what Stoics are. I'm explaining it to you again. There's an external world, there are external activities, there's an external relationship between atoms, between individuals, which you can't change. It's there, it's given, but you can change within. And that's where all the effort is. For them, if you want to achieve the good, which we are talking in terms of whether it is Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, good for you is becoming virtuous. Again, quite similarly to what the ancient Greek philosophers said, that you have to become virtuous. But here, the understanding is a bit different. The understanding is, as I keep repeating, that you can't do much to the external world, but you can do phenomenally to yourself. There is no attempt to change the world at large, as Plato would like to set up a republic. Plato would like to do this, that, bring in education. No, there's nothing external happening. Here it is internal to an individual. So let's go into the details of it. One, the Stoics were very clear that, as I mentioned earlier, we have no control over the events around us. And that's what he says, soft determinism, in the context of your ability to change your own behavior. The entire Stoic philosophy is around self-control. It's all around your response to what is happening to you, because what is happening to you, you have absolutely no control, but how you can respond to that is something which you are in control of. So that's what we say. We do not have any control whatsoever on the events. They are predetermined, but we have control over the response. And all the pain, all the suffering is not on account of externalities. All pain are internal. I'll give you an example for you to understand simply. It is how you condition yourself that you start to suffer or don't suffer. So when air conditioners were not there, people were very happy with fans. But you get conditioned to air conditioners, and then if you don't have an air conditioner, you start suffering. So external factors don't have much role to play. And even if they have a role to play, you can't do much about it. It is your own understanding of those external factors that make all the difference. Someone who's, so to say, calm and composed, if you go and abuse him or say something to him, it doesn't matter to him. But somebody who's sensitive, who looks through senses, then he will start feeling bad about it. So external thing is happening independently of what you are, but your response determines your suffering. That's the bottom line of Stoicism. Happiness and external goods. Happiness not dependent on external goods at all. That's what Stoics were of the view, that happiness is purely subjective. How you respond to an external situation. It is not determined by what you get. So you may have a bicycle today, you start aspiring for a scooter, then you start aspiring for a car, and then for a better car, then a helicopter, then an airplane. There's no end to it. You can go on and on. But if you feel satisfied inside with what you have, because that's your response to the external availability of material goods that are with you, then you will be a happy man. Happiness is purely subjective. Of course, what Stoics have said have come to be understood later as well. Even today, in today's context, probably Stoicism applies more than any other philosophy. So, what Stoics say, that there's no harm in enjoying material comforts. They are not against it. They don't say you deprive yourself. They are not ascetics, so to say. There's no deprivation per se. But if there is a sense of deprivation, there is a problem. So they say you must enjoy the material comforts you are, but if you become dependent on that, the moment those physical comforts are gone, you will have that sense of deprivation, and that's the problem there. And of course, these are all related terms, that misery happens as a consequence of our response. There is no such thing as objective misery. It is how you respond to that misery that matters. And what they finally say is, as I mentioned earlier, each philosopher determines what is good for you. You may have a different opinion. You may feel that, no, material comforts are better for me. Fair enough. That's your outlook. But Stoics felt that you have to determine what is good for you, and then they will tell you how to go about it. And the next one, therefore, is how to navigate, how to acquire those virtues which will make you feel good, which will make you feel happy. So they talked about 4 fundamental virtues that you have, and these are practical wisdom. Now, practical wisdom is something coming out of a belief that human beings are rational, they are reasonable, they are logical, which animals are not. They aren't able to think logically or think rationally. Human beings are. So if you develop that wisdom of what is right and what is wrong, if you think logically, the chances are that you will be a happy man. That's what they're saying. Because then reason guides the judgment. It is not emotions. Unlike Epicureans who were more into senses, we'll discuss them later on, Stoics believed that every decision has to be based on reason. And since human beings are fundamentally reasonable, or they have reason in them, they can come to a rational judgment about issues. Then self-restraint. This comes out from the previous slide that we see, that temperance is very important. This is partly drawn from something which Aristotle also said. He was talking about the golden mean, the balance. Here temperance means that you are not impulsive in your response. You weigh the pros and cons of any issue before coming to any decision, and that's what temperance is all about. If you are impulsive in nature, obviously you are not temperate. Temperance will come if you are able to measure calmly, coolly, rationally, not emotionally. And that's what it also talks about, maintaining free, fair treatment of others. Fairness is the key, because again, you are making a judgment on an issue on absolute reason. And when it is reason, it is fair. It is through emotions when you react, you are unfair. So Stoics in general were against emotional response to the stimulus that came to you, and you have to have courage. If you again look at what Aristotle said, he also focused on these 4 virtues. Those virtues are similar in nature. The Stoics have gone ahead and given them a bit of a practical dimension. And that's why, as we go along in Greek philosophy, they are gradually becoming empirical in nature. In fact, unlike Plato, who lived in a different world, he had a utopia, this philosophy is much more grounded. Anyone listening to this will be able to relate to their real life. So from the principal virtues that we talked about, we look at 10 important principles of Stoicism. These are all interrelated principles. They don't stand alone. You have to understand each one of them, and as a group, they make you a person that serves the purpose of your life, which is happiness. So, firm purpose. You have to decide. You have to clear in your mind what is your purpose. And if you look at even the Japanese philosophy, or for that matter, Buddhist philosophy, they all are similar in nature. Ironically, Buddhism was emerging in India around that time itself. That was the period when Buddhism was coming up. I'm not aware whether they ever got to meet each other, but I think the philosophies are very similar in nature, the Stoic philosophy and the Buddhist philosophy. So you have to have a firm guarding one's mind. Guarding against what? If you don't guard your mind, you get influenced and you react emotionally. So you have to be careful about what comes to your mind. And here again, this is similar to Epicureans also. A lot depends on who you live with, who is in your company, because you're going to imbibe those. Stoics felt that you can imbibe these virtues that they had mentioned earlier. These virtues can be imbibed, and they can be imbibed and learned in a group, or they can be taught. But you have to imbibe these. Now, here again, as I mentioned earlier, Stoics, though were deterministic, were of the view that human mind can undergo a change through training, right? So, handling criticism, this is the biggest part or the most critical part of Stoic philosophy. Usually we react differently to the criticism that comes our way. Some of us think that the person who's giving this criticism is wrong. We react, we write back, or we speak back to him without realizing that the guy who's criticizing may have a particular context in which he is criticizing it. And we can obviously look at it positively also. We can take that criticism positively without taking it personally. There could be some worth in the words that are being used by a critique, and that could be an input for us. So this is very subjective. Whether you want to take criticisms positively or negatively, that choice is with you, and that's what the Stoics say. The choice of reacting to an input is totally dependent on the individual to whom that criticism is targeted. So you can react positively as well. Take the positive aspects of the criticism, introspect and see if some improvement is required. Then transforming offense. So if someone is offending you, you're not condoning his offense. You're not condoning. You are only limiting your response to it. He is committing an offense, he'll pay a price for it. What do I have in that offense? So can we have an empathy for the person who is offending me? Can we try and understand what is the background in which he made that offensive remark? By understanding the background, perhaps we may not react as we would otherwise. Probably he has had a problem at home, and because of that problem, what he's speaking to me is said in words which he would otherwise not do it. I mean, there could be any reason behind it. So if you can become empathetic and you can acknowledge, see, Stoics don't say that you should become unemotional. What they say is you should appreciate the emotional part, but you should not respond emotionally. So you have to appreciate that. Then they say that you have to overcome fear and shame. Obviously, if you do not feel insulted, think over it. If someone insults you, if you don't feel insulted, can anyone insult you? I don't think anyone can insult you ever if you don't feel insulted. So the power of feeling insulted or not, or the choice of feeling insulted or not, is squarely with you. And you have to take a call whether you want to feel insulted or not. In fact, if you take it otherwise, if you don't feel insulted, the guy who's insulting you might himself feel insulted that his effort has gone waste. But that is not material, what happens to him. What is material is what is happening to you. Then you have to anticipate obstacles. Once you anticipate obstacles, you will be able to create your own response, a positive response. You are impulsive because you've not anticipated it. Something happened immediately and you responded to it. But if you anticipated it, you are prepared for that response, and your response would be much better. Then obviously you have to have that inner strength. Inner strength is you must understand what you can and what you can't. This has been brought out beautifully by an American monk by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr. He says, Lord, grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, courage to change things that I can, and the wisdom to understand the difference between the two. What happens usually is, and it's very true of modern day life as well, that we waste so much time on what we can't. We fret and fume. We do still nothing, instead of using that time to do what we can. And hence it's important that you have to understand your inner strength, what you can, and if you focus on what you can, it will give you greater happiness. And that's the ultimate objective, rather than fretting and fuming over something which you can't. Then restraining, pause and reflect, delay gratification. This is also very important. If you react immediately, the chances are that that reaction would be impulsive and you would regret it at some point in time. But if you pause and think and then respond, the chances are that you will be much more balanced in your response, and that's what they say. Power of acceptance. This again goes to the earlier phrase that I spoke about, Reinhold Niebuhr, that you have to accept what you can't change. And that will give you a peace of mind. Again, Buddhism also talk about it. You have to accept so many things. This reason is very simple. You do not have control over objective reality that stands outside you. By merely fretting and fuming over it, you won't find any solution. In fact, it will make you troublesome. And then living according to nature. This is important because Stoics felt that human beings are part of nature. And nature has its own divine, they don't call it, they accept existence of a divine power, but they say that human beings are part of that nature. And once you understand the natural process and try to become a part of it, happiness will come naturally to you. So you have to appreciate that we are a part of a larger concept that exists, larger universe that exists, larger nature that exists. And when you live according to that nature, then you are a happy person. And for living according to that nature, you have to develop those virtues that were mentioned earlier. So this in brief is what the Stoics had said. Now let's come to Epicureans. As I mentioned to you earlier, there were three levels. I had spoken about the spiritual level. I have spoken about the intellectual level. And I had spoken about the physical level. The physical part is basically senses. So for Epicureans, they believed that the ultimate objective is pleasure principle. But this pleasure is not direct pleasure, it is avoidance of pain. And this is important for you to understand, because usually some people who don't understand Epicureans well equate them with hedonism, materialism, meaning thereby for all material things they are going for. No, it is not so. They did believe that ultimate bottom line for happiness is what you feel, that is your senses. But they felt that it is not merely material in its sense, and as we'll explain to you later on, that it is beyond material also. And that is why what has to be understood here is that they are talking about freedom from pain. So something which may not be painful at this point in time, you may feel good about it, like you are drinking or you are eating too much. When you drink too much, when you eat too much, at that point in time you may get some pleasure, but there is something which will trouble you afterwards. And that's why they talk in terms of two types of pleasure. One is the pleasure which is static in nature, the other is which is dynamic in nature. So if a pleasure does not give you pleasure subsequently, then it's not actually a pleasure. It is more painful, because subsequently you get pain. So they are talking in terms of a long-term happiness or pleasure. They use these words interchangeably, but bottom line for them is basically physical. But this physical also they divide at two levels, and we'll come to that later on. They talk in terms of three levels, three forms of desire. One is natural and necessary. For example, food, shelter, these are natural and necessary. It's very natural. Mind you, like Stoics, Epicureans also are looking at nature, what is natural for human beings. There may be some difference between what they deem as natural, but they are also associating themselves with natural, because in the sense of Stoics also, Epicureans were materialistic, in the sense that they looked at things concrete, physical, visible, something which you can when you can feel. They are looking at that, those physical part of it, rather than intellectual or spiritual part. So they say something which is natural and necessary, that you should eat, you should have shelter. Then there is something which is natural, like sex, but it is not necessary. Again, third, which is unnatural and necessary, this is very important. So unlike the usual understanding of hedonism, or people who equate Epicureans with hedonistic people, this is different. They say that acquisition of wealth, fame, all this is unnatural to human being. It doesn't come naturally to him. They are acquired from outside, and hence they will bring in more pain subsequently than pleasure. So they were not advocating a life which is purely materialistic in nature, where you are looking in terms of name and fame, because Epicureans believed that it will bring them more pain. So for them, mental peace is higher than physical pleasure. Here, mental peace also comes from physical pleasure. It's the next level. So that is what you have to understand very clearly. So for example, if you do something now, maybe you will sacrifice at this point in time, but at a later point in time, you will have a pleasure about it. So there's so many sacrifices done. At that point in time, it might give you some pain, but later on the longer run, it will give you pleasure. So it is not pure temporary pleasure that Epicureans are talking about. They also talk about how do you do that. So as in every case, they first define what is good for you. Epicureans very clearly say, what is good? Pleasure is good. What sort of pleasure? Pleasure which is, they define pleasure as static and kinetic. They say pleasure which is immediate may or may not be good for you, but pleasure which lasts longer or which is there for a longer period of time is good for you. So they say this is good. Now, next question is, how do you achieve that good? Like in case of Stoics, each philosopher is looking at how do you achieve that good. And this is what they say: regularity of contact with friends. So the feeling of goodness, of happiness, of pleasure that you have with good friends cannot be replicated. So they say, live with good friends. Then they say, focus on what is natural. There's so many things, and there again, similar to Stoics, Epicureans also come close. They want people to be close to nature, because that's what's natural to human being, is natural and necessary, is something which is to eat, but with temperance. Again, similar to Stoics. You cannot eat more than what you are required. Naturally, you require something. If you eat beyond that, it will bring in more pain than pleasure. So this is something which has to be understood very clearly in the context of Epicureans, that they are not talking in terms of only materialistic pleasure. Their pleasure has slightly different connotation in terms of a long-term happiness or pleasure that you might get. And then they say, don't fear death, because unlike maybe Plato, Aristotle and Socrates and even Stoics, the Epicureans believe that there is no life after death. They look at human beings as physical human beings. And since as physical human beings you die, you don't exist. So it's a very simple thing. By fearing death, you are being foolish. Why? Because when you are dead, you will not even have that pain. It's gone. Physically you don't exist. So why worry about it? So whereas many philosophers spoke of afterlife, Epicureans are very clear in their mind. They say, life, you are born once, you enjoy life, and then you are dead. You don't exist. So why worry about a time when you don't exist? And it is in this sense, they also said that you can be happy if you meditate and you self-discipline. Now, this is typically when you think of Epicureans, you don't have this in mind. This doesn't come to your mind, that they are talking of mindfulness, they are talking of moderation, they are talking of self-discipline. Epicureans felt that if you are disciplined, that you will only do something which is natural to you, which is good for you. So by disciplining yourself, you will not indulge in excesses. And indulgence in excesses does not lead to pleasure. At that point in time, you may feel good, but in the long term, you don't. And finally, stop pursuing sources of pain. This category, unnatural and unnecessary, which is fame, power, wealth, that are unnatural and unnecessary. So Epicureans usually understood as hedonists. That is wrong, because they were not hedonists. They had their principles. They wanted discipline in human life. They were talking in terms of simple living, but they were of the view that if some material comfort is coming to you, you can enjoy that material comfort, nothing wrong, but in moderation. And the other difference which you see between Stoics and Epicureans, and we'll discuss it there at length, is Epicureans were not bothered about public life. They were only bothered about the individual himself. And hence, whatever they said is in the context of happiness of the individual. Let us briefly look at what are the similarities between Stoics and Epicureans, because they existed around the same time in history. So both are materialistic in nature, because for both Stoics and Epicureans, we exist in physical form. We exist as a part of nature, and we have to follow the nature. There are similarities here. Both focus on studying nature. Both are talking of pleasure. Mind you, Stoics are also talking of pleasure. Stoics did not believe that you should not enjoy material comforts. They did, but they always felt that you should not become dependent on that. So is the case with Epicureans. They say that if you enjoy something which you then get deprived subsequently, then you will feel the pain. So is the case with Stoics. Stoics also in favor of enjoying material comfort, but to an extent that they don't influence your existence. They don't make you unhappy subsequently. And both are talking in terms of mental tranquility, because ultimate happiness or pleasure for Epicureans also is mental happiness, though It is obtained through physical senses, but it is mental tranquility, because that is the lasting tranquility, that's the lasting peace. But there were obviously some discrepancies. So, for example, for Stoics, they talked of those 4 virtues that we discussed earlier. They said you should cultivate them. For Epicureans, the ultimate bottom line was pleasure, happiness. Obviously, they defined the pleasure not in the context or in the manner in which we understand pleasure today, but in the context of a long-term happiness that you get as a consequence of acquiring or as a consequence of enjoying material comforts. For them, pleasure is the highest good. Obviously, for Stoics, pleasure itself is defined by obtaining those virtues. So the definitions were totally different. Yes, in the understanding of God, Stoics believed in some supernatural power. They believed in God. Epicureans didn't. They said God didn't exist, and they said if God were to exist, there wouldn't be so many miseries. And if he's helpless, he's not God. So they had reasons to believe that God did not exist, and they felt that human body after death does not exist at all. So the question of God does not arise. And whereas Epicureans focused on individuals, Stoics believed in society, whatever they were doing for the good of the society. So this is the difference between the two. I hope you enjoyed this discussion on Stoics and Epicureans. We will carry on this discussion in the next few sessions. Thank you very much.
StudyIQ IAS, आपका सिलेक्शन हमारा मिशन।